He was 76, alone, and just wanted a quiet breakfast. The coffee was lukewarm, the eggs overcooked, but it was peace. Until a biker slammed his hand on the table, laughed in his face, and did something no one expected. He struck him, right there in front of everyone. The room froze, no one stood up, no one spoke. They didn't know. He wasn't alone. 11 minutes later, the door flew open. Combat boots hit the floor. One by one, soldiers stepped inside, led by a man who called the veteran Dad. And suddenly, silence turned to something else entirely. If the story moved you, if you believe respect is earned through service and sacrifice, like this video, share it and subscribe to Endless Stories. Because sometimes, justice walks through the door in uniform. The morning sun had just begun casting soft golden streaks across the chipped chrome of the roadside diner's window. Inside, the clatter of silverware and low hum of conversation filled the air like background noise to a life that no longer surprised anyone. At a booth near the back, facing the door out of habit, sat a man whose presence went largely unnoticed. He was wearing a worn army jacket. No name tag, no ribbons, just faded olive fabric stretched across a back that had once carried the weight of a rifle and the hopes of a platoon. His name was Frank Teller, 76, retired, forgotten by most, remembered by few. The kind of man who showed up every Thursday, ordered the same black coffee and 2 scrambled eggs, and stared out the window not because the view was interesting, but because it was predictable. The regular waitress, Dana, brought his plate without asking. "Morning, Mr. Teller," she said, her voice friendly but hurried. "Nice weather today." Frank nodded once, the corner of his mouth twitching. Not quite a smile, more a muscle memory. "That it is," he said, voice gravelly and low. She was gone before he finished the sentence, off to the next booth. He didn't mind. He liked the quiet. It was the only thing that didn't hurt. Then the bell above the door jingled. Loud laughter followed, filling the diner like spilled gasoline. 3 men walked in, all denim, leather, and tattoos. The kind of guys who didn't care if they were noticed, they expected it. One was broad and bearded, the kind who threw his weight around not just physically, but socially. He wore a biker vest with a patch that read Blister, stitched in red thread. The others, a wiry guy with a chain wallet and a bald man with a crooked grin, followed him like shadow dogs. They didn't wait to be seated. They dropped into a booth, loud and loose, chairs scraping like warnings. Their conversation was more volume than content, but it grew louder when the bald one gestured toward Frank's booth with a smirk. "Check him out," he said, "looking like he's waitin' for D-Day to come back around." The other 2 laughed. Frank didn't move. He was used to that kind of noise. Words bounced off him like wind off stone. "Bet he's one of those pretend soldiers," Blister added. "Wears the jacket but never served a day." Frank took a slow sip of his coffee, eyes still on the window. That silence, that refusal to react, only fueled them. Blister stood. "Hey, Gramps," he called across the diner. "You salute that toast before you eat it? Or just talk to it like you're war buddies?" Some people chuckled nervously. A couple of patrons looked away, uncomfortable. Dana froze by the counter, unsure whether to step in. Frank finally turned his head. Not sharply, just enough to see him in his periphery. "You need something?" Blister sauntered over, towered over the table. "Yeah, I need to know why a guy like you gets to wear that jacket." Frank blinked slowly. "Because I earned it." That answer, calm, unwavering, wasn't what Blister wanted. He smirked, then, without warning, reached out and slapped the brim of Frank's cap off his head. It fluttered to the floor like a dead leaf. The diner went silent. Everyone froze. Even Dana gasped. Frank didn't reach for the cap. He just looked up, face steady, eyes like iron. "You shouldn't have done that," he said quietly. Blister scoffed. "Or what?" Frank didn't answer. He just leaned down, picked up the cap, brushed it off, and placed it back on his head with the same dignity he'd carried for decades. Blister laughed, turning to the room. "You all see that? Man can't even stand up for himself." That's when it happened. The door opened again. Not with a jingle but with purpose. Heavy boots crossed the threshold in quick, even steps. Then more boots. 5, 6, 7. The sound was different than anything that had filled the diner before. Sharp, rhythmic, commanding. Every head turned. They wore fatigues, real ones. Clean. Regulation. The first man through had broad shoulders and a stare that cut through the room like a blade. His uniform bore the insignia of a captain. He scanned the diner once, and when his eyes locked on Frank, something shifted in his face. He walked straight to the booth. "Dad," he said, voice firm but quiet. Frank looked up at him, no surprise in his eyes. Just the faintest flicker of something deeper. "Son." Captain Teller turned his gaze toward Blister. "Did you put your hands on my father?" Blister blinked. "Who the hell are you?" The captain didn't answer. He didn't have to. His men formed a line behind him, not aggressive, just present. The kind of presence that made men like Blister suddenly aware of how loud they'd been. "Is there a problem here?" Captain Teller asked, voice low. Blister hesitated, suddenly unsure. "I didn't know he was your—" "No, you didn't," the captain said. "You just saw someone old, alone, quiet, and you thought that meant weak." Dana finally found her voice. "Captain, should I call the sheriff?" "No need," he replied. "We're just here for breakfast." He looked at his men. "You know what to do." And like that, they moved, not with weapons, not with threats, but with order. They helped clear the booth next to Frank, pulled up chairs and sat. A formation of respect. The captain sat beside his father, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I got your message. Figured it was time I checked in." Frank didn't smile, but his eyes, for the first time that morning, softened. Blister and his crew, they left, quietly. No more jokes, no more smirks. They didn't look back. Because in that diner, in those 11 minutes, they learned something the hard way. Some men don't need to fight, because the army never forgets their own. The diner returned to a tense sort of normal after that, like a room that had just dodged a tornado but still felt the air pressure lingering. Forks resumed clinking against plates, and murmurs slowly returned to the booths. Yet no one quite looked at the veteran the same way. Not out of pity, but something much heavier. Respect born from revelation. Captain Teller had removed his jacket and hung it neatly over the back of the chair beside his father. His soldiers followed suit, each one now in standard-issue undershirts, muscles coiled and disciplined, eyes sharp but relaxed. It wasn't a display. It was routine, natural, like they had all done this 100 times before. Frank, for his part, resumed his breakfast as if nothing had happened. Just another Thursday. Just another coffee refill. Except this time, the seat across from him wasn't empty. "You didn't need to come all the way out here," Frank muttered, slicing into his eggs with the practiced motion of a man who'd spent decades doing more with less. "I got your voicemail," the captain said. "Didn't like the sound of your voice." Frank didn't look up. It was about the VA forms. That's what the words were about. But the tone said something else. Frank glanced sideways. "You always were too good at reading between the lines." The captain leaned forward. "You taught me how." One of the soldiers at the neighboring table let out a light chuckle. "Didn't know the Cap had a dad this badass," he whispered to another. The captain gave a glance and they went quiet. Not out of fear, but in deference. The waitress, who had clearly been waiting for the right moment, approached with a nervous smile. "Can I, get you gentlemen anything?" Captain Teller answered without turning. "8 coffees, black, and whatever Dad's having." Dana nodded quickly, scribbled the order, and vanished like a shadow. Frank finally turned to his son, voice low and gravel-dry. "You didn't bring them just to eat, did you?" "They're on leave. Couple of them have family nearby. I figured it was time they met someone real." Frank raised an eyebrow. "I'm not exactly the best example." "That's the point," the captain said. "You don't need a parade. You don't need a podium. You just need a seat at the table. That's enough." They sat in silence again, the kind of silence soldiers understand. Not empty, not awkward. just full of weight that didn't need to be spoken. At the far booth, a man in a business suit kept glancing over at the group. Another patron, a woman with a toddler, leaned toward her husband and whispered something, eyes wide. Word was spreading. Something important had just happened here. Blister hadn't returned. Neither had his friends. But their absence spoke louder than their entrance. When Dana returned with the coffees, her hands trembled slightly. She placed each mug down with care, then hesitated before walking away. "Mr. Teller?" she said softly. Frank looked up. "I didn't know. About your son. Or, about you." He nodded once. "Now you do." She opened her mouth like she wanted to say something more, but instead just gave him a grateful look and turned away. The captain watched her go. "You never told people?" Frank shrugged. "Didn't see the point. I didn't serve for applause." The captain reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. He slid it across the table. Frank picked it up. It was an old black and white picture. A young man in uniform, him, standing with two others in front of a helicopter. Their faces were hard, their eyes older than they should have been. Behind them, the jungle blurred into fog. "You kept this?" Frank asked quietly. "Always," his son replied. "You think I joined just for the flag?" "I joined because of who raised me." Frank said nothing, just stared at the photo for a long time, thumb gently brushing the corner. Outside, an unmarked black SUV pulled into the lot. It wasn't military, just civilian issue. But the man who stepped out of it wore a pin on his lapel that immediately drew attention. A retired general. Silver hair. Measured steps. Eyes like steel behind thin glasses. He entered the diner, scanned the room, and made a beeline for Frank's booth. "Colonel Teller," the man said, loud enough for the room to hear. "Permission to sit?" Frank looked up. Recognition flickered. He stood, slowly, painfully, but with dignity. "General Ross." They shook hands. The general's grip was firm. "Word travels fast. I heard about the incident." Frank grunted. "That's one word for it." Ross sat without being invited. Men like them didn't need permission from each other. He glanced around at the young soldiers nearby, nodded in approval. "Looks like the cavalry arrived in time." The captain smiled faintly. "Always." Ross turned back to Frank. "You ready for people to remember who you are?" Frank didn't answer immediately. He sipped his coffee, stared out the window. "I never forgot," he said at last. "But I didn't think it mattered." Ross leaned forward, voice low. "It matters more than ever. Especially now." Frank's fingers tapped the edge of the photo his son had given him. He looked up. "Then I guess I better start remembering how to stand tall again." Ross grinned. "You never stopped." The diner, once just a place for greasy eggs and burnt toast, had become something else. A battlefield of memory. A place where silence was broken, not with noise but with presence. And somewhere deep in the room, someone whispered to their friend, "That man used to be a colonel? Why doesn't anyone talk about guys like that?" Because some heroes don't ask to be remembered. They just keep showing up. Until one day the world catches up and never forgets them again. The quiet buzz of conversation returned to the diner, but it was different now. Subdued, reverent. The presence of uniformed soldiers at the corner booth had shifted the atmosphere. What was once just another Thursday morning had become a story that every single person in the room would repeat for weeks, maybe years. Frank Teller wasn't speaking much. He never did. But he didn't have to. The soldiers around him, not just his son, but the others, spoke in glances, in silence, in gestures that only people trained to respect command understood. The waitress refilled mugs with hands that no longer shook. One of the younger cooks peeked out from the kitchen pass-through, nudging the line cook beside him. "That's the guy," he whispered. "The one the biker hit?" The other nodded, eyes still wide. "And that's his kid, Captain Teller, 3rd Infantry." Back at the booth, Captain Teller was typing something on his phone when it buzzed in his hand. A message popped up, and his jaw tightened slightly. "What is it?" Frank asked without looking at him. The captain hesitated, then turned the phone so his father could see. It was a screenshot, security camera footage from outside the diner. It showed Blister, the biker, storming out, pacing around the lot like a caged animal before speeding off. Below it was a message: known offender, multiple prior disturbances, flagged for assault. Frank didn't blink. Are you going after him? No need, the captain said. Sheriff's department is handling it. Word got out fast. Once they saw the footage inside, they're calling it a hate incident. Frank grunted. Never needed the law to fight my battles. Yeah, the captain said. But this time you shouldn't have to. A moment passed. The captain set the phone aside and pulled something from his backpack. A box, neatly sealed and marked, for authorized personnel only. Frank stared at it. You carrying classified documents in a diner now? He muttered. Captain Teller smiled. Something better. He opened the box and pulled out a thin, flat object wrapped in cloth. He unfolded it slowly, reverently, like someone unveiling a flag. Inside was a framed certificate. Not military-issued, civilian, but official. Frank leaned in, his brow furrowed. What's this? It's from the Department of Defense and the Veterans Affairs Council. They're launching a national campaign, honoring veterans who've gone unrecognized after retirement. Local heroes, people who kept serving long after the uniform came off. Frank's jaw tightened. I'm not a poster boy. You're not, his son agreed. You're the reason the word service still means something. Frank looked at the certificate again. It had his name, Colonel Francis Teller, etched into the glass. Below it, a small engraved plate read, "In service without spotlight, for duty beyond the call." He stared at it for a long time, said nothing. Across the room, one of the soldiers who had accompanied the captain, a younger black woman with sergeant stripes, stood up and stepped toward the jukebox. She dropped in a quarter and selected a track. The diner filled with a soft, vintage tune. America the Beautiful, but not a showy version. One of those raw, acoustic renditions that made your chest tighten. Frank's eyes didn't leave the certificate. The captain spoke again. You always told me that medals didn't matter, that the real reward was living to see the next sunrise. Frank nodded. Still believe that. But sometimes, his son added, the people deserve to say thank you, whether you want to hear it or not. The sergeant from the jukebox returned, stood at attention by the booth and said, Sir, permission to speak freely? Frank blinked, a little surprised. Go ahead, Sergeant. She smiled. I didn't know who you were until today, but I'm glad I do now. Men like you built the roads we walk on. Thank you, sir. He looked at her. For a second, something shimmered in his eyes. Pride. Humility. Pain. All rolled into one. Appreciate that, he said quietly. At that moment, the diner door opened again. This time, there was no grand entrance.
No combat boots. No scouts.
Just one man in a suit, clean-cut and lean, stepping in with a briefcase. He looked military even if the uniform was gone. He approached the booth and nodded to Captain Teller. General Hale, the captain said, standing and offering a salute. Wasn't expecting you here, sir. Was in the area. Thought I'd drop by, the general replied. Then he turned to Frank.
Colonel Télé.
Been a long time. Frank stood, slower than the others but taller somehow, and offered a handshake. Didn't know this kind of company still remembered me. General Hale smiled faintly. Some of us never forgot. Others are finally catching up. He set his briefcase down and pulled out a manila folder. There's a formal commendation. A new one. You'll be receiving it at next month's Defense Honors Ceremony in D.C. Frank raised an eyebrow. I thought I was done with ceremonies. Just one more, the general said. You won't be there for yourself. You'll be there for the ones who didn't make it home. Frank slowly sat down again. His fingers ran across the certificate once more. Then he looked out the diner window. Across the highway, the American flag at the small county office waved in the breeze. Not for show. Not for politics. but for something older, something earned. And for the first time in years, Frank Teller felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't invisible anymore. The ceremony invitation sat untouched on the kitchen counter of Frank Teller's small home, still sealed in the manila envelope General Hale had left at the diner. It had been 2 days since that surreal morning, but the weight of it lingered like smoke after a fire, hanging in the air, invisible but undeniable. Frank hadn't mentioned it to anyone. Not to the neighbors who barely knew him. Not to the man from the VFW who still mailed him newsletters. Not even to his son, who had returned to base later that day, after ensuring his father had everything he needed. It wasn't that Frank didn't appreciate the gesture. He did, deeply. It just wasn't something he knew what to do with. He stared at the envelope now, coffee cooling in his hand, the morning sun casting long lines across the kitchen tiles. His mind kept going back to the look on the biker's face, the flash of surprise when soldiers walked into that diner like a silent storm. Not for revenge, not for violence, but as a reminder. A quiet message. He's not alone. For decades, Frank had lived like he was. Ever since the retirement papers were signed, ever since the army no longer needed him, he'd faded quietly into the background. He didn't blame them. He was an old soldier, and old soldiers were meant to fade away. But the truth he couldn't shake now, the truth he'd spent years pushing down, was that maybe he hadn't faded. Maybe he'd just been waiting. And now, people were looking again. That thought made him uncomfortable. The ring of the doorbell jolted him. It was rare enough to hear it at all, especially this early in the day. He rose slowly, still favoring the right knee that never quite healed right, and opened the door. On the porch stood a young man, late 20s maybe, wearing civilian clothes, but with the unmistakable posture of military training. His hands were clasped behind his back. His jaw was square, his haircut tight, but his eyes held a kind of nervous respect. "Colonel Teller, sir?" he asked. Frank eyed him carefully. "Used to be. My name's Eric Morales, Sergeant, U.S. Army. I was one of the soldiers in the diner that day with Captain Teller. Your son." Frank nodded. "I remember." Morales hesitated, then pulled something from his jacket pocket. A folded piece of paper. He handed it over. "It's from the rest of the unit," he said. "We all chipped in." Frank unfolded it slowly. Inside was a single note, handwritten in blocky, honest penmanship. "For the man who taught our captain how to stand. You never stopped serving, sir. You just changed uniforms." Below it were a dozen signatures. Names Frank didn't recognize, but now would never forget. He looked up, throat tightening. "You didn't need to do this." Morales shrugged, a little embarrassed. "Maybe, but we needed to." A long pause stretched between them. Then Frank stepped back and opened the door wider. "You drink coffee, Morales?" The young man smiled. "Yes, sir." They sat at the table, the envelope still unopened between them. Morales asked questions about old deployments, about leadership, about what it felt like to come home after decades of war only to find yourself invisible. Frank answered, not like a man giving a speech, but like a man remembering how to be heard. And when Morales left, the envelope was no longer on the counter. It was in Frank's hand. That night he opened it. Inside was the formal letter from the Department of Defense. Polished, ceremonial, signed by the secretary himself. And along with it, a plane ticket, first class, to Washington, D.C. Frank stared at it for a long time. He didn't sleep much that night, but when the sun rose again, he stood at his closet, reached past the old jackets, past the flannel and the worn denim. He pulled out the one uniform he had never thrown away. Faded, yes, but clean, pressed, waiting. And as he ran his hand across the chest, stopping at the name embroidered above the pocket, Teller, he finally understood. Maybe some uniforms weren't meant to be folded away. Maybe some service never truly ends. Maybe it simply waits for the moment the world needs it again. And this time the world was watching. Frank Teller hadn't walked through a terminal in nearly 20 years. The last time he did, no one noticed. He was just another face in the crowd. But now, as he moved down the polished corridor of the regional airport, dressed in his old army jacket, the one with the nameplate still stitched over the heart. He drew second glances. Not because people recognized him, but because he walked like he mattered. He boarded the flight in silence, nodded to the flight attendant who offered him a surprised, almost reverent look and took his window seat. The ticket had been upgraded to first class. He hadn't asked for it, but someone in uniform clearly had. The stewardess brought him coffee before takeoff without asking. Black, just the way he liked it. And when the captain's voice came over the intercom, there was a subtle pause. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a veteran on board today, Mr. Frank Teller, retired U.S. Army Colonel. On behalf of this crew and this airline, we thank you for your service. There was polite applause, soft and genuine. Frank gave a nod. He didn't crave recognition, but he understood what it meant for the young man across the aisle, who might one day wear a uniform himself, or the elderly couple behind him, whose son may have never come back. Washington greeted him with heavy skies and the hum of traffic. A black sedan waited by the curb. The driver, a clean-cut woman in her 40s, stood holding a placard that simply said, Teller. She saluted him. Frank gave her a firm handshake instead. Colonel, she said with a quiet respect, we've got you scheduled at the Capitol Marriott. Ceremonies tomorrow morning. The secretary will be in attendance. Frank didn't respond right away. He stared out the window as the city passed him by. Monuments and marble, flags and flash, all built on names like his, yet none of them his. That night, in the hotel room, he didn't sleep much. He sat by the window, watching headlights crawl past below, thinking not about the ceremony, but about the men who weren't going to be there. Jones, who died in '68 and never got a flag on his casket. Reyes, who came home but never really came back. Burns, who stood between Frank and a landmine once and hadn't made it to the other side of the jungle. He wasn't here for himself. He knew that now. He was here to carry their names into the room. The next morning, the lobby was filled with uniforms. Crisp, polished, heavy with ribbons and medals. Generals, senators, representatives, younger soldiers in dress blues, veterans in wheelchairs, some missing limbs, all standing taller than the politicians beside them. When Frank walked in, it was like a subtle shift in gravity. A few turned, then a few more. Conversations paused. It wasn't that they knew exactly who he was. It was that he carried something they recognized. His son was waiting at the edge of the room in full dress uniform. When he saw Frank, he straightened instinctively, then broke into a quiet smile. You wore the jacket. Frank looked down at his chest. Figured it earned the right. Inside the chamber, the seats were arranged in rows, a podium standing between two American flags. At the front sat a panel of officials, including Secretary Dalton, a man who had served once, decades ago, before climbing into politics. He stood when Frank approached. Colonel Teller, he said, offering a hand. It's about time this country remembered your name. Frank shook his hand. It's not my name that matters, Mr. Secretary. Dalton nodded, eyes narrowing with understanding. That's why it should. The ceremony was short, clean, efficient. They called Frank to the front, read a brief biography. His service in Vietnam, his command in Germany, his final posting stateside before retirement. What they didn't mention were the years in between. The quiet ones. The invisible ones. The ones where he fixed fences and changed oil and watched the world move on without him. But Frank didn't need them to say it. He said it with the way he stood. With the way he accepted the plaque that bore the engraved words. Service beyond duty. Honor without recognition. Until now. The applause came, not thunderous, but deep, full, from people who knew what it meant. Afterward, as the hall emptied, a young corporal approached him. Barely 21, eyes wide, hand shaking as he reached out. My grandfather served with you, he said. He always told me stories about Colonel Teller. Said you once held a position under mortar fire for 7 hours straight. Frank looked at the kid. Saw the way his voice trembled. Saw the future. What's his name? He asked. Thomas Hart, the boy said. Frank smiled.
Tom Hart.
Son of a gun could shoot blindfolded. Saved my life more than once. The boy beamed. He'll be so proud you remember. Tell him I never forgot. And in that moment, Frank Teller wasn't a relic. Wasn't a shadow. Wasn't just a veteran eating eggs alone in a dusty diner. He was the bridge between generations. The keeper of stories the world had tried to bury. And now, finally, he wasn't telling them alone. The sun was setting behind the Capitol Dome as Frank Teller walked alone across the National Mall, his shadow stretching long across the stone paths. He moved slowly, not because of age but because of the weight that had settled on him. A weight made of memory, recognition, and the quiet burden of finally being seen. He passed tourists taking selfies, children running between fountains, and joggers with headphones, oblivious to the man in the worn army jacket who carried a lifetime in his shoulders. No one stopped him, and he preferred it that way. The ceremony was over, the photos taken, the applause faded. What remained was this: silence, air thick with history, and the soft crunch of gravel beneath his boots. At the far end of the lawn stood a black wall of stone. Simple, unadorned, yet louder than anything else in the city. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial. He hadn't visited it in decades. His feet carried him there without thought. As he approached, his reflection emerged in the polished surface, fractured by the countless names etched into it. Names of men he knew, men he'd trained with, men who'd bled next to him in the jungle heat, and men who never came home. He reached out and placed his hand on a particular spot.
James Sir. Kelly.
"Hey, Jimmy," Frank murmured, the words catching in his throat. "I finally made it back." A breeze rolled through the trees, tugging gently at his jacket. He stood there for what felt like hours. Didn't move, didn't speak again, just stood. Because in that moment, Frank wasn't remembering the war. He was remembering the quiet moments in between. The laughter in foxholes, the bad coffee, the shared silence under a starless sky. Things that no metal could ever capture. Footsteps approached behind him. He turned slightly and saw Captain Teller standing a respectful distance back, hands in his coat pockets. "Knew I'd find you here," his son said softly. Frank nodded but didn't say anything. Captain Teller stepped forward and stood beside him. Together they looked at the wall. "I used to be angry at you," the captain said after a while, "for never talking about this. For staying quiet." Frank didn't flinch. "I wasn't trying to hide. I was trying to protect what little I had left of it. I know that now." Frank glanced sideways. "You think I did it right? All these years?" His son didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was calm. "Certain. You did it the only way you knew how. That's what matters." Frank exhaled. For the first time in years, he felt like the weight wasn't just his anymore. "You planning to stick around town?" his son asked. Frank shook his head.
No.
"Got a tractor waiting back home. Old John Deere. Needs a new hydraulic line." The captain smiled. "That machine's been in your care longer than I've been alive." "Still hums like a dream," Frank said, then added with a chuckle, "Unlike my knees." They stood together a while longer, father and son, soldier and soldier. 2 generations bound not by blood alone, but by something deeper: service, sacrifice, and the quiet dignity of those who never asked for attention. As the last light faded from the sky, they turned from the wall and walked away, slowly, without words, without ceremony. At the hotel that night, Frank packed his things methodically. He folded the uniform with care and placed the plaque in his duffel. On the desk sat the envelope from the Secretary of Defense. He'd already read the letter 3 times, but he picked it up again anyway. At the bottom, in blue ink, a handwritten line stood out. "You were never forgotten, only waiting to be rediscovered." He stared at those words for a moment, then tucked the letter into his coat pocket and zipped up his bag. He was flying back at sunrise, back to the diner, back to the dusty roads, back to the place where they once laughed at the old man with the limp and the toolbox, but where now they watched him walk past with eyes full of something they'd forgotten how to show: gratitude and something else: awe. The wheels of the plane touched down just after 8 a.m., skimming across the tarmac like the exhale of a long breath. Tucson's morning sun hit the windows with a golden glow, and Frank Teller stepped off the plane not as a guest or a stranger, but as someone returning from something unfinished. He carried no fanfare, no entourage, just the same worn duffel and the quiet look of a man who had finally made peace with a war that never truly left him. He declined the driver the Pentagon had offered. He didn't want the black SUV, the attention, or the uniformed courtesy. He walked out of the terminal, waved down an old cab, and gave the driver one address: the Waffle Diner on Route 46. The driver looked up in the mirror. "You sure, sir? There's a better place." "I'm sure," Frank said. The diner hadn't changed. Same chip sign, same cloudy windows, same flickering open light. Inside, the morning crowd was thin. A few regulars sipping black coffee, a young couple sharing pancakes, the jukebox quietly playing a Willie Nelson song no one seemed to notice. Frank stepped through the door. Silence fell almost immediately. Conversations stopped. Forks hovered midair. Someone at the counter elbowed his friend and nodded subtly. There was something different about the way people looked at him now. The last time he walked in, they saw a quiet old man with a limp. Today they saw the same man but with new eyes. Eyes that had seen the video, the soldiers, the ceremony. Frank didn't gloat, didn't speak. He just walked to the same booth by the window and sat like he always did. Sandra, the waitress, approached with a smile that trembled around the edges. "Coffee, Mr. Teller?" He nodded. "And maybe eggs sunny side up?" He raised an eyebrow. "You remember that?" "I remember now," she said softly, and placed the mug on the table. He took a sip, tasted the same. Cheap, overbrewed, and perfect. The bell above the door rang. Frank didn't look up at first, but the low rumble of hushed voices caught his attention. He turned slightly and saw him, the biker, Blister. Only this time he didn't swagger. He didn't smirk. He looked smaller, less. Behind him stood a deputy, arms crossed. Clearly not here to arrest him. Not yet, but to make sure nothing got out of hand. Blister stepped forward. The room watched. He started, then paused. His voice was rough, like gravel in his throat. "I came to apologize." Frank didn't blink. "You didn't deserve that," Blister continued. "Didn't know who you were." Frank's voice was quiet but firm. "You didn't need to know who I was to treat me like a human being." The biker nodded, looking at the floor. "You're right." Then something strange happened. He reached into his vest and pulled out a small patch, black and gray, with the emblem of a military biker group stitched in the center. He laid it gently on Frank's table. "My old man was Navy," he said. "Didn't know how to be proud of that until recently. Thought if I acted bigger, louder, maybe I wouldn't feel like a coward. Guess that backfired." Frank looked at the patch, picked it up, studied it, then set it down again. "You carry your father's name?" Frank asked. The biker nodded. "Yes, sir." "Then carry it better." No more words were needed. The biker turned, walked out quietly, the deputy following behind. The door shut with a soft click. Silence lingered for a moment. Then the clink of silverware resumed. Conversation returned, slowly, like sunlight thawing ice. Later that day, a group of soldiers walked into the diner. Not for drama, not for defense, just to eat. One by one, they approached Frank's table, each giving a quiet nod before sitting nearby. Not as a guard, but as a witness. And by evening, the sign outside had changed. A chalkboard leaned beside the door, where daily specials were usually scribbled. Today it read, "We serve breakfast, and we remember our veterans." Frank Teller sat in the same booth until sundown, sipping the last of his coffee, the sun streaking through the blinds, warming the silver in his hair. He didn't ask for redemption. He never demanded respect. But it found him. And in a world so quick to forget, sometimes, just sometimes, all it takes is 11 minutes, one slap, and the sound of boots on tile to remind everyone what honor really looks like. Because legends don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear an old army jacket and carry a name the world almost forgot. Until now, if this story moved you, take a moment to remember the quiet heroes among us. The veterans, the forgotten, the ones who never asked for recognition, but earned every bit of it. Like this video, if you believe respect must never fade. Subscribe to Endless Stories for more emotional tales that honor service, courage, and the human spirit. And don't forget to turn on notifications, because the next story might just be one you'll never forget. Until next time, stay humble, stay kind, and never underestimate the quiet man at the corner table.